Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Utility Broadband Alliance webinar series. We know it's a beautiful Friday afternoon for most folks, and everyone will get logged in here to the webinar as we're getting launched. I'm Bobby Harris, the Executive Director of the Utility Broadband Alliance, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. We are going to have a very engaging discussion. I hate to call it a webinar because it's really a insightful fireside chat. And we're going to be very dynamic and hope that all of you attendees will utilize the question function on your toolpad there to type your questions for the speakers. We'll hold some time at the end and try to get in as many of those questions that you have as possible. Of course, as always, if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up after the webinar by email, or we'll just outreach directly. But I want to thank you all for being joining the UBBA members today and for joining this webinar. And I want to turn it right over to Tracy Morales from Itron, our sponsor of this webinar. Tracy's going to take us through this wonderful topic. And Tracy, it's all over to you.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and thank you to UBBA and to Xcel Energy for joining us today. So I'm going to dive right in. I'm Tracy Morales. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Itron, and we are here with Wendell Reimer, the Director of OT Networks at Xcel Energy, and Steve Merrill, Director of LTE Strategy at Itron, to talk about Xcel Energy's experience with building a sustainable hybrid communications network strategy. So we all know that the utility grid is changing and there are a lot of challenges that we need to address and face. And one way that those challenges can be addressed is by really optimizing a network strategy that best meets all of the use cases and other criteria. And so again, we're going to just dive right in, and please, again, as Bobby said, no question is a silly question. We welcome all questions, and we really want this to be interactive. So we look forward to the conversation at the end of our discussion. And so with that, I'm gonna get started with Steve. Can you talk a little bit about what are the key drivers in the market today which are making both public and private cellular networks so relevant?
Sure. Thanks, Tracy, and thanks, Bobby and the UBBA for hosting this. I really appreciate the opportunity. So to answer your question, Tracy, Itron has been developing utility-grade AMI networks for over 20 years. And back in the early days of AMI, AMI 1.0, think meter to cache, utilities needed a network they could rely on and control. And that hasn't changed. They needed a network that could support longevity of 20 plus years, because that's the way the assets were capitalized, and those were the life cycle of those assets. They needed change control and change management so that they could add new meters to provide visibility into the network. They needed to minimize downtime. And of course, they needed resiliency and security. Itron saw all these business requirements back in those days and developed innovative mesh network solutions to meet those challenges, basically to build a network that a utility could own that could deliver those AMI 1.0 solutions. These mesh networks provided really high resiliency and reliability with the ability to reroute traffic. And they gave the utilities the control and the support they needed for these early AMI deployments. And for years, there was no other alternative. That was really all there was out there. But fast forward to the 2020s, and things have changed considerably. PLTE is gaining traction. It's an option now, and it's an option for a couple of key reasons. First and foremost, spectrum has become available, which was not the case 20 years ago. So there's several opportunities for different kinds of spectrum, and it's a dynamic environment that's changing all the time, and more spectrum may be coming available soon. Infrastructure costs have dropped. It used to cost a lot more to build a private cellular network than it does today, but with the scale of the 3GPP ecosystem and the growth in the number of devices that are out there, and with network function virtualization coming into the 4G core and certainly in the 5G cores, the cost to implement the infrastructure is considerably lower than it was in the early days. And finally, the massive ecosystem of chipsets, modules, and end user devices that the remarkable success of 4G has promulgated has offered an opportunity for utilities to build networks to meet their various use case challenges. And this last bit is really kind of often overlooked, but it's a critical one, as the device manufacturer is critical to that cellular network. Xcel and others have recognized this opportunity or are in the process of realizing this by building out real LTE networks, which is really cool and exciting. And virtually all of the IOUs in the US are either evaluating or deploying or assessing whether or not they should choose to deploy a standards-based 3GPP network. It's really interesting to watch the market evolve, and it's a really exciting time. So thanks, Trace.
Thanks, Steve. All right, let's dive in, Wendell. So I know that Xcel has contracted with Anterix for Spectrum and Nokia for your private network infrastructure. Congratulations. And even though Xcel is at the beginning of your private network journey, you're really pretty far down your overall network strategy path. Can you give us an overview of the various networks deployed and how they're leveraged today at Xcel?
Sure, glad to do it. Hello, everybody. The first thing I want to just point out is a little bit of grounding, right? In that, and I know for substation people that means something totally different. But we're really looked at our networks and started going our own path a number of years ago to do what we call IT/OT separation. So we're really separating our network as physically as we can, but if not physically, it's certainly logical to really create a really strong barrier around our OT network. And by OT, I mean those networks that talk directly to the grid, either for monitoring what's happening or actually sending commands out there. So it's two-way communication. And we do that for a number of reasons. Number one is it's a very focused set of requirements. Number two, we really need to protect that so that if other parts of our network either have failures or have, are under attack, that we can cordon off our OT network and keep operating, because no matter what happens, we got to keep operating the grid and serving our customers. So you might hear that term OT and IT separation. That is a formal project we took on several years ago and are pretty near completion. And part of that is certainly technical with how we set things up and direct traffic, but it's also procedural to make people understand that there is a big wall around that and a process to get through it. So I state that to say we're like a lot of the rest of you, right? We have multiple networks we've built and created over the years. In 2016, we set out with a very strong policy and strategy to privatize our OT networks. And we do that through a number of things. I'm going to say these in order of what we do. Again, very similar to a lot of the IOUs and others out there. We do OPGW fiber, which is the fiber that runs along the transmission lines. And we work very closely with our transmission group and planning, 5 and 10-year planning, as well as how we create that connectivity. And one of the reasons I bring this up is a lot of our OT connectivity, whether wired or wireless, goes through our substations by intent, believing that, and we see it today, and we're seeing more of it coming down the road with distributed computing that happens out in the substations or even at the meters or on the feeders, and devices talking to each other. So you'll hear that come up. We also have third-party fiber where we work with other providers, some of the larger network providers, to really more in our core metro areas like Denver, Minneapolis, St. Paul, etc., where we have that capability, and that serves not only our ability internally in those metro areas to communicate, but also creates resiliency with the OPGW fiber and others. We have microwave we use up in the mountains and across Wisconsin and New Mexico and Texas, where there's just not a lot of infrastructure out there, so we use a lot of that. And then we use satellite for hard to reach places today. And then finally we use leased circuits. So that's kind of the pecking order we do. And our goal, if you're all familiar with satellite and leased circuits, including third-party public cellular, those are O&M, and we need to be able to drive our O&M down, as well as other reasons we'll talk later. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of what our particularly our OT networks look like.
Thanks, Wendell. Back over to you, Steve. So obviously Xcel has put a lot of thought into building a network communication strategy that is sustainable and is meeting, their requirements. Can you speak for a few minutes about why this hybrid technology strategy is so important?
Yeah, sure. Wendell, you certainly laid out a very coherent strategy for separating IT and OT and for leveraging those 4 key technologies. And we at Itron, we completely agree that this hybrid strategy of leveraging the best technology for the use case and for the scenario makes the most sense from an economic standpoint. Mesh, cellular, fiber, backhaul, separating OT, IT to ensure security and reliability, it all makes a lot of sense. I will say that there's been a lot of discussion in the utility space about leveraging LTE networks to consolidate some of these resources and functions and to reduce the number of networks that a utility has to operate. And some of the other utilities that have purchased spectrum and are building out networks are doing exactly this. We're trying to do exactly this. But as Wendell explained, the reality is it's really challenging to consolidate things. LTE may enable a utility to consolidate a couple or 3 different networks down to one. Maybe LMR and DA could be merged, for example, but it's likely impractical to take all of your 20 plus networks and put them onto a single LTE network, simply because it wouldn't be cost effective to do so. So a hybrid network that leverages the best available technology for the particular scenario, and when I say scenario, I mean not necessarily a use case, but because it's a subset of the use case, you might use fiber to backhaul your AMI traffic or your DA traffic, or you may use cellular to backhaul it. It all depends on the scenario. If you have the fiber, you're going to use it. But that's likely the minimum cost solution from a TCO perspective.
And Steve, you talked about, one of the drivers for utilities looking at private networking is this ability to be able to do some level of consolidation of their networks.
Sure.
Can you speak for a few minutes about what Itron is doing to help utilities that, still are going to have multiple communication networks?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, we've been in the mesh business for over 20 years for AMI, and we're working towards doing some of that consolidation. In addition to the 2 or 3 networks that you can do from a use case perspective, we're trying to unify the functions that go into provisioning and management of those networks to reduce the numbers of panes of glass down to hopefully 1, but maybe 2 or 3 or whatever it takes. And on the cellular side, we're working towards combining the SIM provisioning, the SIM management, the SIM lifecycle management. That's the OTA management of the SIM itself, where you might change the PLMNID roaming list or similar, or you might add an applet to the SIM. And then also eSIM profile management, that is to control which SIM is active, maybe add a new SIM to a profile in the future as you develop a new relationship with a new MNO, or to recover from after a failure. Like you could have multiple SIMs where SIM profiles on a SIM where you fall back for increased availability. And whether they're all AMI or DA or other use cases, the SIM technology is critical to resiliency because it's costly to build cellular networks today with the same level of reliability that we're used to in the old voice days or even the fiber days, even from fiber. Fallback to a secondary carrier is critical because it enhances that availability, and the eSIM will simplify that process. And when we add similar provisioning to and device management functions, that is provisioning the SIM itself and getting the SIM, activated on the network, whether it's the private or the public network. And if it's a public network, now you've got to interface with many different service providers networks, and they all have their own provisioning and management tools. So we're consolidating that, and then we're combining all of that with device management and our already existing management of our mesh networks under one umbrella to, again, minimize the management and control responsibilities and reduce those O&M costs.
Thanks, Steve. Wendell, so, obviously, Utility Broadband Association is very focused on private networking and helping utilities, understand what's really important there. But I thought we could take a few minutes to go back to when Xcel went through your selection process for the FAN for your AMI network to understand, what drivers prompted Xcel, during that selection process, and besides, true meter to cash, what were some of the other key use cases that were included as part of that overall decision-making process for your FAN?
Sure, it's a good question, and I didn't dive much into what's called the FAN or the AMI network in the earlier answer because I knew this was coming up, right? So when we started our advanced grid back in 2016 effort, which was really focused around, the new metering, certainly meter to cash, like you mentioned, but we also did a pretty deep dive into what kind of network do we want based on requirements of meters as well as DA devices like cap banks and reclosers and others, and brought that forward to the industry. And so remember, this is back in 2015, 2016. Private LTE wasn't quite there yet, but mesh was, and there were 2 or 3 providers that there. We worked with all 3 of them, did some pretty in-depth studies, but really what drove us in selecting the RF mesh we did, which today is Itron, was being able to do not only the meter capabilities, but also what we saw as advanced capability coming down, and we'll talk later about distributed intelligence and other things, but also be able to drive DA devices over that network in the short time. Or long term, it would be private LTE if we choose to go that way. But the really thing that attracted us to the mesh network was the failover capabilities. So we've I think I might talk about this later, but we've never had a P1 incident in our mesh network, and we support well over 1.8 million meters today and growing. We're deploying across 7 of our 8 states, and the 8th one will start next year. And it really doesn't matter the back, haul connectivity that I mentioned earlier. We prefer to do it over fiber. We prefer to do it over third-party fiber next and microwave, but we can also do it over public cellular. We can do it over whatever. So we really built that network to be independent of the backhaul, that we do. And it's been very successful for us in that way, for sure providing, connectivity once we cover an area, and we like to be 6 months ahead of any device going in that area like a meter. But it also allows us to extend the life of those meters, and be able to work with those devices by upgrading firmware and other things for up to 15 years, right? Keeping the hardware in place. So those are some of the key drivers for that area in the business, not just meter to cash, but also those are about location as well as voltage optimization and 2-way switches, and you kind of name it. Anything that you can think that goes on a feeder can talk through our mesh network.
Great. And can you speak to any of the lessons learned or challenges that Xcel faced as you went through that selection process for the FAN that you might have been able to take away and put into learning as you went through your next iteration of decision-making process for, whether it was your private network or any other communications network? And I'd really be interested in hearing, both about external challenges and internal challenges.
Yeah, I think first was to make sure we had a clear set of requirements, right? And we all spoke the same language, whether that was latency, whether it was bandwidth, whether it was resiliency, security, whatever. But we really created a foundation around that. Second thing was to really consider the length of the technology life and think about how that plays into rate cases and how we recover these costs and how it plays together. So you get into, you know, technology obsolescence and making sure we don't do that. And it's not just the network technology, it's the technology that we're speaking to, whether it's RTUs or meters or whatever. And then finally, really taking into consideration the skill and the labor to both deploy and do run state support. So that collaboration with our business units was critical all the way through start to finish, and really looking at things end to end rather than just one small segment of that. I think we were very, very clear as we went through this, linking everything we do to facts, and those facts include devices that are out there today, those that they're planning to and are in the 5-year capital budgets versus wishful thinking, because wishful thinking is one thing that can drown any project or program you do without some of that clear facts. You know, and then I would really say it's a journey, right? Whether it was through the mesh, whether it's through looking at private LTE, whether it's whatever we do, it really is a journey, and you really have, you know, 24 different rear view mirrors you're looking at and forward looking, you know, windshields that you're looking at to make sure that you don't spend 2 years deploying something that by the time you deploy it, it's obsolete. And that just means constant communication, constant awareness. We had security experts on the front of this program for particularly private LTE as well as the mesh from day one. So we kind of got known, I guess, from what I hear, of writing rather lengthy RFP documents. Our private LTE and our fans were 100 pages long. I know the vendors out there just love that. But what it does is it really sets a really clear, detailed expectation of what we're trying to accomplish. And it minimizes surprises as we get into defining contracts, ordering hardware, and configure. You're going to have some challenges. You know, we're putting up and configuring 2 of our towers today to talk device to end through our new private LTE. And you're going to run into things like DNS and other things. And I think it's being as clear as you can, but then being prepared with a good team of experts, both your vendors as well as your internal experts to, you know, react and get there.
Thanks, Wendell. So, I mean, I think, you know, some of the key takeaways there obviously are things that we could leverage, you know, in a lot of different, you know, business scenarios, right? Like, you cannot over communicate, right? Both internally and externally, having, of course, that really clear set of requirements, and then, you know, the right team of people, because as you say, I mean, it's a lot of visibility forward and backward and, you know, peripherally. Steve, do you have any, you know, follow-on comments, you know, to what Wendell said?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I couldn't agree more that, you know, collaboration and leveraging all of the resources is critical. I mean, you know, this technology is, you know, evolved over 100+ years, right? Radio has been growing, and this is probably the most sophisticated radio standard that's out there. And so it takes expertise all over the place. And the best way to get that expertise is through collaboration with your vendor partners, with the UBBA, which has been an incredible resources for utilities, and with other utilities themselves. And so I know that's why the UBBA was formed, and it's done an incredible job to bring utilities together to share lessons learned and bring the vendor community in to help educate everybody. So this is a totally, you know, it's a really powerful set of technologies and tools, but they're going to take some work to implement and understand. You know, and I was with a large IOU earlier this week, and I gave them that exact same advice. They're early in the beginning of process of evaluating LTE, and I said just leverage UBBA, leverage Wendell, leverage SCE and SDG&E, leverage the vendor community. And, you know, because I kind of view building an LTE network as sort of a 3-legged stool. It's 3 pieces to it, you know, that you have to have the infrastructure piece. And so there's a whole vendor community around the infrastructure. You have to have the company that's going to build it. That's the MNO or the private network operator, you know, in this case, the utility. And the third one is the device manufacturers. And this, as I mentioned earlier, there's a massive ecosystem of devices and some massive amount of resources around those device vendors. But you need all three to build the network. And a lot of times the device vendor kind of gets forgotten in the process because you're off just trying to build a network and you're getting the infrastructure built and you forget that, you know, I need a device that works on this network, and LTE doesn't come with a set of interoperability standards. I mean, it comes with standards, don't get me wrong, but there's no interoperability testing associations. And so that interoperability is done by the utility itself or by the MNO that's implementing the network. And so we need to work towards expanding that ecosystem. And, you know, as Wendell, I think I'm sure you know that, you know, the 900 spectrum, band 106, uses a non-typical a frequency offset of 39 megahertz versus the 45 for everybody else in band 8. And it's permitted completely by the standards, but that doesn't mean the chipset manufacturers have implemented it. And so we need to work together as a community to get more of those chipsets from Qualcomm and others to support that band, so that we can leverage it with more devices. And the folks like Itron can then use those chipsets to build devices that could work on that network.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Wendell, so, I mean, I feel like you've set a really good background for, you know, the key requirements and business drivers and use cases that were behind the decision for your FAN network. Let's jump forward now to the same, you know, set of business drivers and key use cases and requirements for Xcel determining that you needed to deploy a private network. Can you talk through at a high level, you know, some of those key reference points?
Sure. And, you know, kind of adding on to that is myself, my team, and our network group are really driven by what's going on in our company, right? What are the things we're doing? Are we doing more solar, both solar gardens and, you know, utility grade solar and wind farms and, you know, the whole DER conversation, batteries and microgrids and all that. And so, you know, our advanced grid effort, you know, started driving that a while ago. And while we were deploying that, I think most people know we ran into the fun with CBRS and WiMAX, which kind of put WiMAX, you know, off into the pasture. So while we already had, you know, planned capabilities to switch over to public cellular and eventually private LTE, and it's in our testimony and everything. But, you know, while the team was focused on deploying with public cellular, as we switched to that, we really took a step back and really just started gathering facts across the enterprise, all of our business units, what devices are out there and others, and you know, what was important to them. And out of that came, you know, a certain interest in cost control, right? If we, you know, everybody and Duke and others and Ameren were seeing 500% to 900% increase in devices, you know, out in the field that we need to talk to. And so we kind of calculated our own number, and it was close. It was in that range. But then we kind of, you know, showed over the next 5 years what that means in terms of monthly costs, as well as, you know, 10-year, 20-year, 30-year. And I bring that up because if you really try to justify private, you know, networking and private LTE in particular here with a 5-year life, you're going to fail, right? It's going to be a very expensive adventure. So you really need to think about and talk with your business units about strategically where you need to go. And that means you need to look into the future, 5 years, 10 years, you know, even 20 years into the future. And that creates some interesting conversation. And from there, as we got through all those costs, did 100 different, you know, cost control and IRR spreadsheets for those of you that have to justify costs, you know, that means. And very quickly, as we started talking to our regulatory team, and we have 2 new OPCO presidents from last year who are just tremendous individuals, they kind of flipped it and said, yeah, that's important. I really like that. But the way we're going to talk about it with our commissions and staffs and others is around resiliency and security. And with security, it's all about, it's not that, you know, cellular providers, public, you know, don't have secure environments. It's just that we don't know. We can't control it. We don't see it. We don't do any of that. And that's really important to us, particularly in a utility, particularly in the OT side. you know, we whether somebody else is doing it or whatever, we are responsible for that. So from a security perspective, that not only allows us to monitor end to end, but it also allows us to react and reroute and cordon off and do things that the security people do so well. Secondly is resiliency. You know, a lot of us got used to the fact that, oh yeah, we're going to have outages every month. There's going to be fiber cuts. There's going to be solar flares. There's going to be whatever. And we kind of got used to it. And the reality is, and one of the things that the mesh networks help us prove within internally at Xcel is you can actually have a network that doesn't go down, right? And you can design it that way. And it's, in my humble opinion, it's a little easier to do that with wireless versus fiber. But both of them working together along with microwave means you got all kinds of options for creating that resiliency and the tools out there for automation and rerouting and detecting and things like that. That's about as technical as you're going to get. But it really allows you to drive towards, you know, zero downtime for critical infrastructure. And most of us thought, you know, 10, 20 years ago, that was impossible, but it's a reality. You can actually do it. We do it. You know, you point out how much it costs, and there's some areas of your network where you're going to go, okay, we'll face that risk because we can live with an 8-hour, 24-hour outage. But it creates a really interesting conversation around expectations of a network versus something you just order so that you can communicate. And, you know, I'll go back to the business cases. We focused very heavily on what I'll call tactical business cases around our electric distribution and our gas, and they're very excited about that, but we have a list of 10 to 20 and growing other business use cases that are following up behind it. And once you deploy a wireless network like this over a certain geography, the cost of adding new device and the speed with which you can do it is very attractive to our businesses and very attractive to our customers. So those all come into play along with what I mentioned earlier about our ability to segment our network in such a way that changes in one area don't affect others. So by deploying private LTE, we really don't impact our FAN deployment at all. We have cellular modems out there that can switch over to with a SIM card change, which gets back to what Steve was talking about. And SIM management is, I don't have great answers for you on that one right now, but we're in the middle of it and deploying our first set of SIMs here this week. So
good stuff.
That's exciting, Wendell. So you talked a little bit about this, you know, in terms of segmenting your IT and your OT networks. You talked about the fact that you know, are able to deploy your private network and not impact your FAN. Talk for a few minutes about, you know, any work that you did or how Xcel sees, you know, is there overlap in the FAN and the private network and how you expect them to work together? Can you speak to that?
yeah, I would say, I don't know if I'd use the word overlap, but I would say you have choices, right? Our electric meters will continue to be deployed using the mesh and the FAN RF mesh that we're doing. And part of it is because the meters we're buying, they're 15-year assets, right? And they need to last that long, and that's how they communicate. Do I think in the next, you know, 1, 2, 5, 10 years, there's going to be electric meters out there that communicate with private LTE? Yeah. Do I think we'll retrofit ours? Probably not, because we don't need to, right? There's no added value to us in doing that. The mesh is running, you know, terrifically. I do think in the gas metering area, for example, you know, that's a different case because the mesh faces some other challenges there just because of the battery life of the gas meter. It gives you options, and particularly as you know, along the lines to 5G. And the great thing about, you know, doing it privately is that we will choose when we go to 5G and where we go to 5G rather than being forced to do it by a vendor, which I get why they do it. So it's not a cut on them. It's just we will have that capability to really have our own decision-making path for when we do that and where we do it. And devices that today, you know, like DA devices that communicate just fine over the FAN, if we can get them talking directly to private LTE with a minor SIM card change, that's awesome, right? Because it reduces the amount of hops they have to go through and increases the, or I should say, reduces the latency that we can support. And so I really don't see it as an overlap. I see it as, you know, choices we can make, whether we're building out a new environment or whether we're putting new devices on to our network. As long as we are standards-based, which is the #1 thing, and Steve mentioned the 3GPP is critical to all of us. That drives the manufacturers, and that's really it's good to have standards, but what we watch is what equipment manufacturers are really following those standards and gearing up to support them, and that's typically the direction we will go. We don't want to be the lone wolf sitting out there going, oh, look what we did, but nobody else is doing it. That's dangerous.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, Wendell. Thanks for clarifying. Steve, so, Wendell hit on security, resiliency, and, also, the importance of, whether it's device manufacturers, software providers, infrastructure providers, all, working with the same set of standards. Would you like to comment on any of those things?
Sure. Wendell said an awful lot of good stuff. So just as the resiliency and the security, just to start with that, obviously there's no substitute for a mesh network when it comes to resiliency, just because you have so many different paths. This is well known and well understood. Fiber rings are great for resiliency, and they've provided us with incredible voice services for years until the cell phone networks came along. And they provided that service by having 2 fibers. Basically, you make a ring, and if one side gets cut, it's self-healing within 50 milliseconds using UPSR or BLSR or one of these other technologies. That migrated to mesh, started to migrate to mesh about 20 years ago when I was at an optical company for the same reason, because the denser that mesh, the more resilient it is. And cellular comes along, and it's actually kind of was a step back in resiliency, as we all know. We all know that there's dead spots in cellular, but that doesn't mean it's going to be hurt the resiliency of Wendell or anybody else's network, because it's, as Wendell said, it's just another tool in your toolbox that you can use, and as long as you have the coverage at the particular location, you're going to be fine. And you're going to be able to provide the level of availability that you need for that particular use case. But when that cell tower goes down, or if oftentimes you only build one fiber into a cell tower because it's just too costly to do that. So if that fiber gets cut for the backhaul piece, or the cell tower goes down, or there's a loss of power, often there's generators, but not always. And I'm sure in Wendell's case there will be, but in the commercial networks, those are all real scenarios, right? And the easiest and best way to handle that in real time would be with an eSIM, which is this new technology that I mentioned earlier that enables the fallback to a secondary carrier for an interim period while the primary carrier is out. And so that will provide a level of availability that just isn't there in most cellular networks. Wendell and Xcel have the advantage of building their own private cellular network and having full control over it, and controlling the migration to 5G, as he said, when that 5G ecosystem is available, and has the same level of control over how it's built and what sort of redundancies get added to it. And then I think you mentioned security as well, and obviously security by design is a critical piece of it, and LTE networks were designed from the outset with security in mind. So obviously if you use a public cellular network, you're stuck going over somebody else's infrastructure, but if you build your own private network, you've got complete control of that very secure infrastructure. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the only portion of the cellular transaction or communication that's not encrypted is that RACH protocol, that random access control protocol at the beginning, because it can't be. But everything else is encrypted. And of course, we have SIM cards, which were developed in the 90s after the first generation of cellular networks were so badly hacked that the cellular carrier said, well, we need something more secure so we don't get our services stolen. And they came up with this incredibly powerful authentication tool called a SIM that was so strong that it's almost never hacked, and you don't ever see this thing hacked. And then it's been adopted by banking cards today, and it's on all our credit cards and all our debit cards, and that's how secure it is. So, if you're controlling that network and you're building that private network, it's really going to be pretty rock solid, and the only holes are the ones that you let in yourself because you overlooked something. So pretty straightforward to make it pretty rock solid and secure. And then back to the final point about having just access to different technologies and choices. I liked how you put that, Wendell. You have choices by building the cellular network. You don't have to use it here. You can use it to swap out the backhaul maybe for your AMI network, but why would you want to rip out your AMI network that's performing fine and providing the level of resiliency that we just talked about? That wouldn't make any sense. But maybe at the end of the 15-year life cycle of those meters, maybe so. But in the near term, doesn't make any sense, and it's just a question of having another set of tools in your toolbox to do more things and more innovative things.
Thanks, Steve. Wendell, you spoke about, thinking about these decision-making processes as a journey. For anyone in the audience that is, kind of at the beginning of that journey, can you speak to kind of the time frame for Xcel in building out the business case for the private network, so that you can give some perspective there?
Yeah, sure. I'll kind of put it in a few segments here. Between 2014 and 2016, we did an awful lot of study of our OT environment and really, got a picture of everything we had. So it really painted a really complicated picture. I think you need to know that, right? And then you need to put some stakes in the ground, and that's where privatization of our network came into play. So I do that because then you get up to, okay, we're really going to look at this thing where private LTE might be a solution. And instead of saying, here's what private LTE is, what can we jam into it as a use case, we really flipped it and said, what are our use cases? So we weren't going out and trying selling technology and networking to our business units. We were really talking about where are you going, where are the devices, what kind of connectivity are you going to need, and a lot of it was in certainly electric distribution, because that's where we were working really closely on our advanced grid. But we got to understand, you hear the term DERMS all the time. It's like, oh, we got to do this for DERMS. Well, in reality, the network really provides connectivity from those end devices to whatever you call DERMS, and it's usually an application and data pile, right? And that's EVs, it's microgrids, it's batteries, it's, et cetera, and really understanding, having them explain it to you, and then you echo it back from a networking requirements perspective, gains an awful lot of trust, right? So those meetings are critical. And having that conversation, I call it a journey, because the last thing you want to do, it takes about 2 years to take something like this from, an idea and something you're going to research to taking it to the board of directors, to ask for, 100, 200, 300 million dollars, whatever it is you're going to ask for. And you want people sitting in that, committee and the executives to have already heard the story before, right? And they want to hear it from their own people. And for those of you that were at UBA on the panel, we had Tim O'Connor, COO there, that, basically said that he plays two roles. One is certainly the approver of checks, because he, is the only one authorized to write these big checks. But he's also responsible for operations. So he wanted to hear it from his own people that, yes, this is a good thing for their operations. And that takes time. And everybody and every, utilities and telecom groups in a little different position there. So you got to kind of, plot your own course. But I would deal with facts. We were very clear. I had one slide that was in every single one of my slides all the way up to the board that said, here's the facts, here's some assumptions we're making. And people they can argue the facts, but, that's kind of useless. But they can always talk about the assumptions. And once you get agreement around the assumptions, whether it's your growth factors, whether it's what you're playing for O&M today, that ends up being a decision that people support for strategic direction. And if you talk to our CEO now, Bob Frenzel, he will tell you, and he's told others that told me that, when they bring up our private LTE and our Entrix and the spectrum, he goes, that's a 30 to 40 year investment for a company. It's not a 5 year, it's not a throwaway. So it really is setting the direction for where we go. But it takes time, and you got to build that trust. And there's things you do along the way that you've heard me talk about, but I think it's really, my suggestion would be, don't say, hey, I'm going to set out to prove out private LTE. I'm going to set out to really understand where our company is going for OT connectivity, and then lay private LTE and whatever other networks you have on place, so you show the full picture end to end.
Thanks, Wendell. And I mean, that sounds obviously like an incredible amount of work, but a much better way to understand across the organization you know, what the true requirements are and really be able to gain that internal stakeholder buy-in, you know, versus, you know, going out and, you know, socializing it the other way around. Did Xcel do any pilots as part of your business case process, or, you know, after the decision was made, you know, that you were going to kind of move in that direction? And if so, outside of proving out the technology, you know, what were any learnings or key learnings from any of the pilots that you did?
We did, although I'll change the term. Instead of pilots, which begs of O&M, we call them limited deployments, which means when we're done with it, we don't plan on throwing it away. And in fact, what we're deploying and implementing this week at 2 of our sites was actually the sites that we used for that limited deployment. So, and to your point, it really proves out the technology, right? But it also proves the technology and the things involved, even some really minute things out of, you know, a tower or the RAN equipment you're putting up for the substation folks, for the business, you know, unit folks, gas and others. It gave them a chance to touch the technology and realize it's not that scary, right? It's advanced from what we've had in the past, but it's really, you know, pretty straightforward for people that are going to use it. You know, certainly, you know, our technical folks that work, you know, in you know, behind the panels and all this stuff, it is very complicated. But from how we deploy it, it's not. And I think that was a calming effect to a lot of our leaders, both in the business unit and the technology side, that this is proven technology. It's based on standards. It's used by public, you know, cellular companies. There's very strong vendors in this arena that have a wealth of experience, and, you know, including, you know, the ones that you guys have mentioned. And then it becomes, okay, how do we deploy this? How do we, you know, track it? And how do we run it? You know, that's one thing we don't always talk about. You know, yes, there's a part where you have to justify it, but part of that justification is knowing how to deploy it and then knowing how to run it. The last thing you want to do is deploy a network and then realize you need 50 people to run it that you don't have on your staff today, right? So you need to plan that out. Automation is key, you know, and just really staying strict in terms of your scope and you know, how you're deploying this so that it can run efficiently without our users getting too involved. So that was really the things that we learned and wanted to prove through our limited deployment.
Great, thank you. I think we already touched on, you know, kind of some of the process that Xcel undertook to make sure that you had that key internal stakeholder buy-in. One of the other things that I wanted to touch on, though, is, I mean, obviously across an organization, there's going to be many different business processes, you know, that each individual business unit might have. Were those business processes taken into consideration as you went through that, you know, communication process and understanding, you know, not only like the devices that, you know, each unit might be working with and those kinds of requirements, connectivity requirements, but also what are the key business processes? How are those going to be impacted, you know, with this new network, and how can they be, you know, folded in and also consolidated in a way that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one, by the way, that applies to whether you're deploying a mesh or whether you're deploying a private LTE. Anytime you're putting a device out, you know, a network out there to talk to devices that the business units, you know, rely on to run their business and do it safely, it comes into play. And so one of the things we've really tried to do, even going back to how we support the mesh with our distribution folks, is to streamline those processes, right? It's one thing to deploy it. You're going out and you know those geographies, but guess what? New houses get built, new streets get built, you know, an extension to a feeder might occur. And if that's not, that's what we call business as usual, right? So you not only have to do the deployment, but you also have to get into those processes where new neighborhoods are being defined, new houses are going up, and that creates new meters, new electric connectivity, all these other things, right? That your network has to be an integral proponent of. So now you got planning and construction groups in your business units that aren't quite used to working with the telecom people and vice versa. And, you know, You want to talk about, creating trust. That's, the people in the field that drive our trucks and serve our customers, on the poles and underground are the core of what we're all about. And so you really have to have that servant attitude out there with them to, deliver it and do as much as you can to map not only to their processes, but the systems that they use. A lot of times IT and, and network groups will bring in their own network management tools and their own, monitoring tools and all that, and they're not the same that the business units use, including asset management. And so those are the things that when you talk about process end up being really gotchas if you don't think about them ahead of time. And what you end up happening is what our executives are calling, this is an enterprise level solution that we're deploying. This is not a technology services thing. It's not a distribution thing. It's not a gas thing. It's being used across our enterprise, across 8 states. So we need to figure out the commonality and work towards that. And that's not always easy, but putting it out on the table and starting to whiteboard that is really where you start realizing you have more in common than you think. But doing that early is really critical to making sure you get a smooth transition, because otherwise you got people chasing their tail all over the place, and that's expensive. A lot of truck rolls.
Right. No, that makes sense. Steve, any follow-on thoughts to Wendell's comments?
Yeah, just you said so many good things again. So where do I start? I mean, I loved a bit about listening to the business units and collecting their requirements first, because as a sales guy and a systems engineer, that's just the right way to go about it, right? Like we at Itron are trying to do the same and listen to you, Wendell, and listen to the rest of the community and develop products and services and solutions that are designed to meet those objectives. Because if we can help you achieve your objectives, then we'll meet our objectives. It'll be a win-win for everybody, and that's always the way to go. As far as the collaboration, obviously that's really critical. Getting everybody on board is important. And with maybe I'll talk about DI 2.0, right, or AMI 2.0, which is distributed intelligence a little bit, and how we see a merger between AMI data with DA, because the data from AMI is going to be critical to enabling DA operations to operate more efficiently and possibly even in real time. And then on the other side, on the DERM side, where Wendell talked about the EV charging, batteries, and everything, similar is true, because we have apps on our meters in AMI 2.0 that enable location awareness. They enable transformer monitoring, EV awareness. You can actually see the full load behind an existing transformer and understand exactly the loading on that transformer, so that you can couple it with a DERMS application or an EV charging application that shuts down a particular EV, because you happen to know that EV is online at the same time, and thereby you increase the useful life of that transformer, because now it's not operating at 110% of capacity. So there's so many things that can happen when we begin taking the data from AMI and bring it to the DA side and the DERM side. Of course, that creates a challenge, in how the IT and OT networks are structured, and we got to think carefully about how that data crosses over between those two worlds. But it's going to create an incredible amount of opportunity and value for the utility for things like volt-VAR optimization and conservation voltage reduction opportunities. I would also just say that all of that is the biggest struggle with all of that is probably going to be what Wendell was talking about earlier, and that's around the system processes and the institutional, stovepipes that are developed inside utilities. And, there's a specific way of doing things, and that's going to have to change in order to leverage these tools. These tools are really, really powerful in the long term, but it's going to take us a while, and it's going to take the utilities a while to figure out how to change those processes to best leverage these tools and this data. And then on the field testing piece, I would also say that, another thing that's overlooked is, I loved how you did the field testing, Wendell. But on the device side, I've talked to a bunch of utilities that are looking at private LTE, and I think testing of the devices themselves and ensuring they interoperate at a level of interoperability that is right for your network is critical. And things like PTCRB are organizations that do that kind of testing, and so you're probably going to want to include requirements for device level testing before you let somebody on your network, so that device doesn't create havoc on the network. And the major carriers do this, and they're the ones that have figured out how to ensure interoperability. But each of them, particularly the large ones, have their own set of requirements and their own set of certification standards. But in any case, you know, if you have a good set of device vendors and a good set of infrastructure vendors, you can develop a whole set of tools and devices that can do all kinds of powerful things with these networks. And as Wendell said, it's not hard. It's doable. I mean, it's not easy at the same time because it's a complicated set of standards, but totally doable and creates incredible power for your utility and your network.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I think we're getting close to time, and I want to take any questions that we have. But before we do that, I guess Wendell, and then I'll turn it over to Steve. Just any like last thoughts or advice for utilities, as they embark on this private networking journey.
Yeah. Great stuff. Stephen, I'm going to go back to something, I think one or both of you said earlier, and since this is a new book call and Bobby's on, it was just fantastic. That was a critical organization, to us as well as others like EPRI and such, and EEI. But, I will just say that, I leaned heavily and learned an awful lot from, a handful of people, certainly Alan and his team from Southern, Link, and, my semi-retired friend John Hughes from Ameren, and Chris there, and others that, JJ with Evergy and Cindy. They were very gracious in talking a lot with me and my team and vice versa. And I think, the rest of you should do that exact same thing. That's why we're here. It's not a competition, right? We all want each other to succeed in this area, because that way we create, a much stronger ecosystem and a much stronger, solution base that we can deploy going forward. So, I sincerely hope, that's continues to be the focus at UBA and other organizations. I think we're getting attention from, the executives, certainly with EEI and others, that this is a big deal. It's not cheap, but it's incredibly valuable if, you go about it in a good, positive direction. So I just wanted to re-echo that point, and that's why, we do things like these podcasts, is to really help others, and we get stuff in return too.
Thanks, Wendell. Steve?
Yeah, I echo all of that. UBBA has been an incredible resource, and Bobby has done an amazing job building it to where it is today. It came from nothing a couple of years ago, and it's been such a valuable resource to Wendell and so many others. So I'd encourage those of you at the beginning of your journey to join, to connect with Wendell and the rest of the utility community, to leverage the vendor community, because the very, very active vendor community, there's lots of people that'll help you understand the different aspects of LTE, from the 3GPP standards to the GSMA standards, to the SIM technology that's often overlooked and can trip people up from time to time, and so, yeah, and if you're in the middle or the end of the journey, just kind of take a step back and just take a look at what you're doing and make sure you have all the bases covered, because it's easy to get tripped up by missing something somewhere along the way. There's plenty of resources available, and folks like us at Itron are happy to help. Wendell's happy to help, and there's lots of us out there, so take advantage.
Thanks, Steve. All right, Bobby, I think we have 2 minutes left for questions.
Yeah, and we have several, so I know we won't get to everything. And I appreciate everybody who did put in questions. I appreciate all of you guys too. I think you hit on several of the questions. So I guess the only last thing I want you to just look ahead at is future innovations, this question around future innovations, because we have a question around how do you integrate with existing infrastructure, and I think you've sort of talked through that, but think about integrating, migrating, and future innovations, and just some final thoughts on the evolution of the hybrid comms networks for utilities.
I'll take a quick shot at that. The 3 things that came to mind as you were, asking that question, and it's kind of been mentioned a little bit, but lot of us have land mobile radio, right, or LMR systems, and we have a lot of money invested that, whichever vendor we went. I think one of the next, things we're going to be looking at is extending push to talk over private LTE, right? The land mobile radio and the solutions that we provide are very critical to our field operations folks, from both of us safety, but efficiency and outage, management. And I think down the road, the more we as utilities learn that when we go to help each other out during disasters, being able to have that common communication platform over something like LTE and doing, extended push to talk is going to become critical. Don't ask me how we're going to do it, and I'll probably be retired when it happens, but, I think that could have a very positive impact to our industry nationwide. And I think, secondly is that, move to 5G and beyond. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of testing, there's a lot of this and that, and it's not for the faint of heart. But I think that's going to be one of the next, things we talked about in the next 5 years is who's doing it, how fast are you doing it, what's the true value of doing it now versus 3 to 5 years from now. And then I think, the last part of it is how do we efficiently, run these things, technical term, I know, with automation and really, just really be professional about it. And, there's a lot of cool things going on. A lot of, each individual company is doing some things as we are with the tools. But that's going to be a great way to help people more efficiently run these networks, particularly as they become hybrid. It gets a little more complicated. And that's going to be, an eSIM management, as mentioned. That's one of the next, mountains to climb. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you, guys. Anything final, Tracy, from your side?
No, just thank you so much for hosting us, Bobby, and for anyone in the audience who is not a member of UBBA, I highly encourage you to check out the organization. It's a wonderful collaborative place where technology vendors and utilities are coming together to, promote and understand private networking. So thank you, Wendell, and thank you, Steve, and thank you, Bobby. I hope everyone has a wonderful.
Yeah, thanks so much. My
Thanks,
pleasure.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.